I'm Tamara, and today I'm going to walk you through all of the steps that you need to know so that you can make this adorable spiderweb table topper for Halloween. This is a super easy project, I promise you. Just follow the steps and you will be able to do this. This particular one I will show you how to make first, and then the one behind me I will show you how I added those strips if you would prefer to do that method over this method. And then at the end I'll show you all of the steps that you need to do to quilt your project together and finish it up. So let's jump into that tutorial. Oh, and did I mention that you can add an adorable little spider at the end? I highly recommend doing that. If you do, definitely link me on Instagram. I would love to see all your adorable little button spiders as well. Okay, now let's jump into the tutorial. Alright, so at first this project might look fairly similar to my hexagon tutorial, but believe me, there are differences, so hang on. You are going to need 4 strips of black fabric, 3 strips of white fabric, and then you'll need some black fabric for your backing, as well as some batting. And then cut all of your strips by 2.5 inches by 42 inches, essentially from selvage to selvage. So some fabric comes a little longer than 42 inches, some fabric a little bit shorter. Make sure it's not much shorter than 42 inches, but you can go longer. Once you've cut out all of your strips, then it's time to sew them all together. So you will have a total of 7 strips, and you want to make sure that your black strips are on both outer edges. Then start pinning all of your strips together and sew them all together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The easiest way that I found to do this was to sew the bottom 3 strips together and the top 3 strips together. And then I pressed all of my seams open as I went along, and then of course finish by sewing both of those outer strips to that center strip as well. And now we are going to cut this panel into strips again. As you can see here, I'm folding it in half. You can fold it in half, wrong sides together or right sides together, whatever you prefer. All right, so as you cut your strips, you obviously don't cut it in half, but you kind of pick and choose how you cut. So you might leave a little bit on the right, a little bit more on the left. You could go straight down the center. You kind of want it to be random. You will not cut the left strip. You want this strip to stay as thick as it is. The right strip you will cut, but you don't want to cut it too thin on the seam side. So when you cut this strip, try to leave about 1 inch on the right hand side. That way you're leaving a little bit under 1.5 inches close to the white seam. So by doing this, I'm leaving more fabric on this side than this side. That is important. Alright, so we've cut up all of our pieces, and what I've done is I flipped around the middle ones so that we have a pattern going black, white, all the way through. But we've got these 2 end pieces here. So what you'll do is you'll just take this strip and you'll move it over. The reason for that is you're making sure that you have a nice thicker black strip on the far end. It's not as thick as this one, but you want it to be thick enough that the middle of your project will not end up with a few white pieces and then a few black. You can see there's a tiny little black tip on that triangle. So what happened, all 3 of these triangles did have a black strip, but the strip was so thin that once I sewed my seams, it covered it up. And now you can see the white. And I really wanted to have a black all in the center. So now that we have all of our strips in random cut sections, it's time to sew them all back together again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, the best way to do this is to just slowly work your way from the outer edges in until you have 2 nice big sections that you can sew together. And while you're sewing all of these pieces together, it's helpful to take it to the iron and press open your seams as you go. And now it's time to cut out your triangles. To do this, take your quilter's ruler and find the 60-degree line on your quilter's ruler, and that will allow you to cut your triangles all the way across. You should end up with 6 triangles total. Now you can lay them out into your hexagon pattern, making sure that you place them in an every other pattern. That way they are nicely mixed up. And now it's time to sew all of our triangles together. To do this, you'll sew your bottom 3 together and your top 3 together first. You'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll just pin across the side and sew all the way along from point to point. And once again, don't forget to press open each seam as you go along. Once you have 2 halves, now it's time to match up the center point and then pin all the way across, sewing another 1/4 inch seam all the way along, finishing up your hexagon. As you can see, our lines do not match up, and that is on purpose because even though a spider web is perfect, Halloween is spooky, and as a quilter, what's more spooky than your lines not matching up? And as you can see, some of my strips did end up lining up, which actually bothered me for this particular project. But hopefully people are not looking too closely and they won't notice. Before I show you how to finish this project, I would also like to show you how I added strips in between all of the triangles if that's the version that you would like to make. If you don't want to make that version, that's totally fine. I will leave timestamps in the description down below, and you can just skip ahead to the section that you want next. For the center strips, cut out 2 strips at 1.5 inches by the 42-inch selvage to selvage. That should give you enough fabric to work with to add strips between all of your triangle pieces. For the first few triangles that you're adding strips to, it won't really matter how you add them, just as long as you leave about 1.5 inches extra on either end. Attach the strip with the right sides facing together, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam along that outer edge. And then take it to your iron, this time pressing your seam to the side. And now it's time to add a second triangle. To do this, you want to make sure that the tips and the outer edges are all lined up. The way that I found was best to do this was to just line up those 2 tips, take a ruler, and draw a line all the way across that top edge. That way I knew where the starting point was for me to pin across and then sew another 1/4 inch seam. Use this method to attach 3 triangles together, so you've got your top half and your bottom half. And now we have our final strip to attach. This strip will just be one long strip that we will attach in the center. However, because we added those extra strips in between our 3 pieces of triangle, it does make the edge of our project a little bit uneven. So just take a quilter's ruler and cut straight across, that way you have a nice straight edge before you're attaching the 3 triangles to that center strip. Then take your strip, lay it right sides together on top of your project, pin across the edge, and sew it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then use a water-soluble pencil and draw a line from your center triangle straight across that center strip of fabric. This will help you match up your center triangles before you sew your final seam. And this is what version 2 should look like once you're finished. And now it's time to finish our table topper. For the rest of these steps, you can do these steps for version 1 or version 2. Lay your backing fabric down, then lay your batting fabric on top of that, and then lay your table topper on top of that, and then take your quilter's ruler and trim around the entire outer edge. Then take the table topper and the batting fabric, keeping that together, and lay it right sides together to your backing piece of fabric. The reason why I like to lay it face down on top of the backing fabric is that way I can still smooth out the batting as best I can before pinning in place. So I'm using some quilter's pins here to just pin the entire project in place, and then I'll be using clips for around the entire outer edge. And then I'll use 2 straight pins to mark a 3 to 4 inch opening on one edge. So those are my little unicorn pins there, and I will not sew across that marked edge. Then take it to your sewing machine and start at one of those marked pins and sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way around, ending at the next marked pin. And now it's time to clip away all of the corners before you turn it right side out. This will help you get crisper points for your project. So once you've cut away all of those points, making sure of course not to snip over our seams, then it's time to turn it right sides out. And then when you're turning it right sides out, either use your finger or the end of a chopstick to push out those points a little bit further. Make sure not to push too hard, otherwise you might pop the point out completely. Then take it to your iron and just press out all of those edges, making sure to fold in that opening and press it as well, so it's a nice seam for you to sew across. Then pin that open section shut, bring it to your sewing machine and sew about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around your entire outer edge. And then it's time to quilt your project. So put some pins in it. I actually think I did too few pins in this project. So add a bunch more pins, because the more pins, the less your project is going to move around while you're quilting it. So take it to your sewing machine, and for the most part, I recommend stitching in the ditch along your seams.
Or you can use the side of your sewing foot as a guide along that seam, and then your seam will just end up alongside the outer edge of your seam. And then if you want to, you can always add a cute little spider to your project. To do that, all you need is a couple buttons and some thread.
If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I always answer your questions. I might not get to them, you know, within an hour or a day, but I do get to all of your questions and I try and help you out as best I can. So definitely leave me a comment down below, and if you want future tutorials, hit that subscribe button. I hope you guys have a wonderful day and a spooky Halloween. I mean, the spider is so adorable. It's my favorite part. It's so cute. It's the only spider I think is cute. Let's make that very clear. This is the only spider that I can be around.